So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here. And if I can just remind you to please mute your microphones and remember that we are recording this session for all those that are not able to be present with us this morning. On behalf of the Jesuit Schools Networks Conference Office, welcome to our latest Ignatian Inquiry session. The JSN seeks to be a supportive resource to our member schools, and this virtual session is designed to be just that, a carved out space to listen and to learn and to engage with colleagues. We are eager to encourage a spirit of inquiry across the many layers of our work in Jesuit education, and we envision our particular brand of Ignatian inquiry to be the art of inquiry as seen through our Ignatian lens, asking questions and exploring issues that matter in our schools through the frame of our shared Jesuit mission. For those of you I do not know, I am Kristin Cully, and I serve as Director of Inquiry and New Ventures with the JSN's conference team. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Kristin Smith, who is on the call here, who leads all things communications for the JSN and will help us to enjoy a smooth Zoom session here this afternoon. If we might begin, as we do, with an opening prayer. If we can quiet ourselves and be reminded that in being together, we are in the presence of God. In the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And I'd like to share a reading from a retreat coordinator at Bellarmine Jesuit Retreat House in Illinois, Mandy Dillon. And she says, "The Holy Spirit is my favorite person of the Trinity. Jesus uses the image of the wind that cannot be controlled to describe the Spirit. And that idea is both incredibly accurate and rather disconcerting. If we are overly concerned with sticking to our own plan and controlling for any or every possible outcome, then we are likely to miss the work of the Spirit. On the other hand, if we are open to the sometimes whimsical guidance of the Holy Spirit in our lives, life can become an amazing adventure. When we allow the Spirit to blow where it chooses, we may find ourselves somewhere we never would have expected, but which is also exactly the right place for us. The unpredictable can become an incredible blessing, for as St. Ignatius taught, God knows the deepest desires of our hearts even better than we do, because he gave them to us. Lord, please help us to be more open to the work of your Spirit in our lives. Let us be better attuned to the ways in which the Holy Spirit works to get our attention, and then to be able to follow wherever it may lead. We pray in particular this afternoon for the grace of imagination, of creativity, and of patience. St. Ignatius, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Welcome formally to our concluding Ignatian Inquiry session of the 2022-2023 school year entitled Putting Learning by Refraction into Practice, Ventures in IPP Enrichment. How do we move away from the IPP as a framework that's in the air and move towards intentionally using the IPP in the design of learning experiences across all classrooms, programs, and non-academic offices? How do Ignatian educators engage students in deep reflection that leads to inner transformation and authentic action? In this concluding inquiry session, the mission and formation team at Jesuit High School in Portland, Oregon, will share how they implemented their learning from the 2022 JSN IPP Summer Master Class on Learning by Refraction through their design and facilitation of workshops and retreats at Jesuit in Portland and within the JSN. Through taking a deep dive into 21st century Ignatian pedagogy, the team will share a remarkable example of how their efforts serve to further promote our collective goal of forming Ignatian educators as reflective practitioners. The work they will share emerged from the JSN's Summer Master Class experience last summer, and their efforts are representative of what we hope for in creating this opportunity for professional development for educators across the network. I'll share a bit of the context of the masterclass learning to set the stage for their presentation. The JSN Summer Masterclass program is a collaborative effort between the JSN and Educate Magis. For the first time last summer, we welcomed participants from Jesuit secondary and pre-secondary schools across North America into a cohort of educators who participated in this masterclass experience. The Summer 22 learning was focused on learning by refraction, 21st century Ignatian pedagogy, in partnership with Father Johnny Go. This cohort-based synchronous and asynchronous masterclass proved a valuable opportunity to further promote our collective goal of forming reflective practitioners. And roughly 60 educators, including the 3 that we will learn from today, from about 30 schools around the JSN participated in the inaugural cohort, engaging in their own professional growth and at the same time continually deepening the mission of our schools as we seek to support the students in our care across the JSN. The broad goal of the masterclass is for participants to master an important part of Jesuit education, in this case, a modern look at the IPP and how best to infuse it in our roles in working to care for students, and then return to their respective schools to spread their learning in deliberate and strategic ways to colleagues. Today's inquiry session will offer an example of how 3 educators on a mission and formation team did just this, sharing their learning in thoughtful and intentional ways within their community at Jesuit High School in Portland and beyond to our greater network. So we're excited to highlight and to learn from their work today, as well as all of the thought and care and time that went into it. So it's my pleasure to introduce our 3 speakers. Greg Allen is the current Ignatian Formation Director and Theology faculty, having held the positions of campus minister and theology chair over his 34-year tenure at Jesuit. Russ Fiorella is about to complete his 2nd year of teaching within the theology department at Jesuit. Russ's professional interests include project-based learning, instructional leadership, and designing workshops and programs for adult learners. He will be starting doctoral studies at Gonzaga University this summer. Jennie Kuenz teaches physics and works in Jesuit's Arupe Center, where she oversees global networking and ecological justice. She is an alumna of the school and is in her 19th year teaching at Jesuit. Jennie, Russ, and Greg are representative of the very best of JSN, and we are grateful for their partnership and their engagement that is at the heart of so many of our efforts to support the work of schools across the network. So I will turn it over to my 3 colleagues to lead our session.
Thank you, Kristin. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, just give me a second while I share my screen. Okay, to open things up this afternoon, Jennie, Greg, and I thought that it would be fun to do a little exercise to get the juices flowing a little bit. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to watch this 1-minute clip. And as you're doing so, think about the 3 questions that you see on the left of the screen. And this is kind of a see, think, wonder exercise. I've done this many times with my students.
I don't think this is their Zoom, so I can't share their Zoom ad.
Oh. So as you're watching the clip, think about what you literally are seeing happening in the clip. And then also, what do you think might be going on in the clip? And then also, what are you wondering about? So I'll play this, and hopefully in the beginning, the audio is difficult to hear, but it picks up about 10 seconds in. Here we go.
So is the aim to like use it in order? Oh, sure.
I thought the part was interesting about fundamentals and kind of I think it's kind of put it into like such a neat category of like these are the two risks. Yeah, right. Like this is the spectrum. And totally.
We need to review that article. We read it when it first came out.
Yeah.
It'd be really good for our students to read it. I think the idea of it was interesting when they ended up finding out about things. So critical thinking lives on the spectrum between fundamentalism and relativism, and then underneath all that is, are we still waiting for relativism? Which makes it Ignatian, right? Because without that, then it's just like being smarter.
The idea that critical thinking is one of the students that we always had like a service program, and we made that part of our curriculum schedule. It was almost like it was like a parachute to kind of.
Okay. So I'll give you just a few seconds to think about the questions. Again, see, think, and wonder. And then I'll stop sharing my screen. I'm going to ask anyone in the audience maybe to unmute themselves and maybe start with things that you observed or saw. Or perhaps you could talk about things that you think might be going on, or things that you wonder about. Any of the three.
I've seen this activity done, so I know what was going on. But what I am wondering is, what's the story with the guy who was standing up and then pulled out his cell phone, right? Everyone else seemed engaged and he just seemed like he wasn't. So was there an emergency? Was he not feeling well? Does he not like group work? That's my wonder.
Seeing definitely a lot of active learning, a lot of engagement, wondering if each of the tables are doing the same activity. Is it a content area, specific content area? Are they moving through a lesson or doing an assessment? I love the engagement and the active learning.
Right. So just a little context, and we're going to continue to go back to this clip a few times in this presentation, but this is a 1-minute clip of a workshop that Jennie, Kuenz, and I, and by extension Greg, put on at the cohort gathering in Omaha, Nebraska in November. And it was specifically for academic leaders. And what they were doing was building a map. They were creating something. Again, like I said, we'll unpack that later in the presentation, as we go. But just keep that in mind as we proceed here. Just share my screen again. I'm having trouble here. Oh boy. Okay, let's see. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. As Kristin mentioned in her introduction, last summer, Jennie and Greg and I joined educators and academic leaders from across the JSN in a virtual master class in the IPP that was based on the book Learning by Refraction by Father Johnny Go. One of the ideas in Father Go's book that really caught our attention and is at the heart of Father Go's modern version of the IPP is the idea of refraction or refractive learning. Refractive learning's emphasis is on reflection and action, and it integrates thinking with rich forms of feeling and doing, and in doing so, empowers students to explore and deepen their sense of self and their purpose in the world. which is so essential for the context we find ourselves in today with what we've learned about learning in students post-pandemic, and also with the rise of artificial intelligence. Rather than simply reflect content back at teachers or allow content to travel through students, learners need to take that content and bend it, change it, wrestle with it, pull it apart, put it back together in a new way, and make it their own. A perfect image of this process of refractive learning is of the image you see on the left, of the light that expands and takes a new form when it travels through the glass lens. And also Herbert Simon's quote. Herbert Simon was kind of a pioneer in political science in the 20th century. The quote at the bottom, I think, also kind of reinforces this idea that, you know, in this age of AI, it's not enough for kids to be able to just regurgitate information. That's no longer considered knowing, right? They have to be able to do something with it, to find it and to use it. So what does it take to make refractive learning experiences happen in classrooms and programs, even in adult learning and administrative spaces? Well, one of the things that is required is shifting away from traditional teacher and student roles, which are listed there on the left, and moving towards the desired teacher and learner roles outlined on the right. So think back to the clip we just watched. We've all been to conferences before. Typically, what happens at conferences, the presenter or presenters are standing in the front of the room, assuming the roles of experts and performers and even inspectors, while the audience is kind of in the position of the sponge kind of soaking in the information. And as a spectator just kind of watching the performance unfold, and also products or kind of like piggy banks who are, you know, being filled with information or coinage, what have you, little of which will be retained and has little value to them because what they've learned, they've never learned how to apply it in their own context. But in contrast, going back to the clip, the adult learners we just watched were positioned as inquirers, as meaning makers, as they kind of thought about the reflection question that Jennie and I posed to them, or as creators, as they built a map, as they mapped students' journey and developed visual representations of different obstacles and challenges that students encounter in their 4 years in high school. On the other hand, Jennie and I, and by extension Greg, were circulating around the room. And I think I'm in the front there kind of engaging with the group. You know, so we assume the roles of designers of the experience. We are also facilitating the reflection, and we're trying to coach the transfer of learning. So by shifting these roles, the result is a richer, deeper, and more meaningful learning experience for all who are involved. A little redundant, but it's really important, we think, to hit this point home, that our team's overarching goal this year and moving forward is to leverage the gift of learning by refraction in order to work towards making an even bigger shift, a shift from traditional and transactional teaching to transformational and authentically Ignatian learning. So we're aiming here, and this is kind of this first year was the beginning of this, the first steps, for scalable and sustainable change, to move away from the IPP as a framework that's just kind of in the air. People know about it, right? And moving towards the IPP being intentionally used in the design of learning experiences across all classrooms and programs, and eventually non-academic spaces on campus at Jesuit, and then also perhaps in the JSN, right? It's ambitious change work, but critical nevertheless. Before I turn it over to Greg and Jennie, who are going to kind of tell this story, I think it's really important to kind of make mention of one of the keys to our success, which was structuring the design of these workshops and retreats using this 4-step framework, which is essentially the IPP, but using different language. As we know, the IPP, well, in 21st century IPP pedagogy, right, there are big cycles of the IPP, and then within that big cycle are kind of little cycles of the IPP. But essentially, there's a big skeleton for any workshop or retreat that we designed. We would set some context, and then we would go into an anchor, right, which is kind of like a mini experience. We would then move from the anchor to reflecting on that experience, and in doing so, introducing new knowledge. And then there would be practice, application of that new knowledge, and then further action with our ways. And again, we'll go into this, and Jennie and Greg will provide some examples of anchors and ads and applications and ways as they share about our work. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg Allen, who's going to start us off.
So when we finished our course, the three of us knew that we wanted to share this in some fashion with our faculty. So one of the first things we were asked to do was to think about how we might put this into some sort of adult learning for our faculty and staff. We have three basic things that we created. One was a faculty in-service. That was the very first thing we did for new teachers, and that was in August. We put that together. I'll speak to that in a moment. We also then were given 5 faculty meetings throughout the year to engage the faculty with this process of design learning. And so we developed sort of a program throughout the year, going from context to experience, reflection, action, etc. And then we also did a few new teacher cohort retreats for first years and for second years. And so we designed a retreat experience where we actually led them through this type of process of learning by refraction, and while also teaching them about how to design in this fashion, etc. That all led to us being asked to go to 2 JSN cohort gatherings, which Russ and Jennie talked about, the Omaha one, and then I joined them down in Dallas. So let me talk first about the faculty in-service and maybe the whole idea of an anchor. Our first workshop, you can see some of the new faculty members, some of the things that they said, and these are some of the things that they talked about. We looked at the different roles of a teacher nowadays and to when we maybe were in school. We talked about assessments and how do we do it in context, and just giving them a richer language around the IPP. Next slide. So when Russ and Jennie and I design these workshops, we always come up with an anchor, as Russ talked about. This was our anchor for that first in-service. We had them pretend that they were survivors of a plane crash, and they had to figure out from a list of things which ones they would keep and which ones they could only take so many items. And so it was that was the anchor that we used to then talk about and present teaching in a new way. So we planned the whole thing in sort of a backwards designed way. And below in the slideshow, which I think Kristin will have, is a link to the scenario activity sheet that we used. Next one. So that was a like a couple of hour workshop, but this was the next thing, our full faculty things. These were 5 full faculty meetings over the year. This was the second type of programming we developed. We didn't have staff go. We focused primarily on teaching faculty. We had a 45-minute time frame for each. And as we planned these and went through the year, we basically tried to present to them the key concepts of the book Learning by Refraction, and walking them through what all are pretty familiar with, is those context, experience, reflection, and action pieces of the IPP. But we always had an anchor, and we always had something that they were going through. There's the 5 that we created: empathy through context, building empowerment through experience, etc. And we always had an anchor, and we always gave them new information and gave them a design focus each time, and gave them time to practice in each meeting. And so we as facilitators really tried to model design-based teaching as presenters. One of the things we moved into probably about the 3rd or 4th meeting was reflecting on insights. And these are become key in the new version of the IPP, Learning by Refraction. In insights, this is one anchor we used. How would you get around New York City, particularly Manhattan, if you've never been there before? And there are certain destinations or points of interest that help someone make sense of a new environment. And insights are like that. Insights are like destinations, points of interest. And the real focus that we try to do is get the individuals to come up with or come to certain key insights. And an insight is not a fact. An insight is like a thesis statement. It has to be debatable, has to be defendable, and it has to be deep diveable. And that's language that once we start using it, people then have more buy-in. They begin to understand it and apply it, hopefully, in their classrooms. Next. So the second type of thing that we did was new teacher cohort retreats. Jennie, is this you?
Yeah, I can take over from here.
Yep.
I even want to take a step back before we start talking about this, because I think the whole purpose of this course that the 3 of us took, and so to kind of go back to basics for a moment, all of us on this call know the IPP very well and know it in and out. But I think what we find even as veteran educators is that we tend to spend a lot of time, at least I do, in the context and the experience realm. And what we found as we went through the course is that it's the reflection and the meaningful action that comes out of reflection that often tends to get short-sighted and shortchanged in our teaching, as well as when we work with adult learners. So again, all of these experiences that we're sharing happen to be ones where we're working with the adults in our communities. And the hope was that by kind of leveraging these audiences that we then would be able to pass some of that knowledge down to our teaching faculty, who then could begin to implement it in their classrooms. And so what you'll see as we go through some of these examples is just this idea of how do we, when we go back to that chart that Russ showed at the beginning, how do we move from those traditional kind of modes of teaching that so often are our comfort zone to the ones that are a little bit more of our desirable. When we think about 21st century teaching and leading, how do we design in a way that allows our students to be the ones who are making meaning? Because when they are reflecting on it and going deeper into that, then they are creating meaningful reflection for themselves. It's kind of that idea of the light passing through the prism, right? So if they aren't having it actually bend and go through them, and they're just reflecting it back. I'm a physics teacher, so this concept of if I'm just reflecting light back, I'm not actually processing it, and I'm not thinking about it in the way that it can apply to my own context. And so that ultimately was our goal, as we've been sharing a couple of these things, like that hook at the beginning, and then the different ways that we've structured the activities that we're engaging our faculty is how can we get them to engage in a deeper level rather than us just talking about information, but really having it processed through them, which takes time, as we know. And so these 2 faculty retreats that we got to lead were helpful because they were a 3-hour time span. As we all know, that's a gift to have that compared to a 45-minute window. And it really was a privilege to be able to hit home with our 1st and 2nd year teachers a couple of these things from the beginning. So the hope is that rather than just telling them about the IPP or having it, I mean, for years, I don't know if any of you can relate to this, I had to go back and look at a little map on my wall so I could remember what the 5 components were. But the hope is that by actively participating and doing, they would be able to remember it in a deeper, more meaningful way. And so these gave us, so we had 2 separate retreats, one for our first year cohort, and that included staff, and then one for our second year cohort as well. And the idea was that we really tried to be, again, those 3 examples of 21st century teaching. So we were designing and we were facilitating and we were coaching, but we were not directing people towards information. We were letting it bubble up to the surface. So Russ, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. And the way that we kind of landed on, and over the course of the year, it's been a journey for us, the 3 of us, to work together. And we didn't mention this, but we span decades of time here at Jesuit. So between the 3 of us, Greg's super veteran teacher, I'm veteran teacher, Russ is relatively new to the school. And so to have that cross section as we look at our faculty and look at just our depth of kind of Ignatian identity was really helpful as we brought that to the table. And so one of the very first things that we created for this retreat, and we modeled then our cohort gatherings in Dallas and Omaha off of this, was viewing our students' journey as a map. And so really looking at here, we have the context that we've provided people, we've given them some opportunities to experience, but how do we act on this? What do we do? And so how do we make some of this new knowledge concrete? And so the framework that we happen to use, and those of you who were at any of the Ignatian colleagues gatherings, you got to go through this. It's the exact same thing we did at the ICG. We did it in an hour and a half, but with our retreat, we took 3 hours. So we had a little bit more time. And we framed it through the 4 strands of the International Colloquium that focused on how do we educate for faith, depth, global citizenship, and reconciliation. And we showed the participants a video, so a little 5-minute video, and then asked them to reflect on kind of what stood out and looked for opportunities to share what are some of the obstacles and some of the hurdles that our students face in their journey as they go through Jesuit High School. And as you can see, we ended up with some really creative responses as the participants really thought, and they worked in a partner group, and you saw at the ICG, they were in a table group, but to begin to design and create for themselves using, and the next one that we did, we actually used Legos. We had those available too, so it was a little bit more 3-dimensional, but it was surprising to us how invested each of the participants were, because again, they were creating meaning and they were processing. And then we asked them, in this particular case, because it's a smaller group, to come up and share for the whole group, hey, what stood out to you in this video? What is it about how we're educating for depth in the 21st century that resonated, and how do you think that this applies to where our students are at? And so we know based on the feedback that we got that the participants left with a deeper understanding of that. And then of course we can't just leave it at that. So what we asked participants to do then was to actually set some change goals. So what are some things that you would like to change in your classroom or in your department area or in the area that you have influence? Because again, we had staff present, not just teachers, classroom teachers. So that was one of the things. And then the second was to look at what are some of the hows. So some of the tactics that we would use. Russ, if you want to go to the next slide. So how will you go about and change some of those goals? And again, this is a clip or a little screenshot from one of the videos, which are in Educate Magis, that really gets at what our students are looking at today, right? They're wanting to ask these big questions of who am I? How can I make a difference? What am I living for? And we want to provide as educators this ample time and opportunities for our students to be able to think about those questions and to probe deeper, to just to look beyond themselves. But we felt like this was an excellent entryway to provide teachers and program directors, people who are working with students, with sort of a starting ground to be able to do that in a deeper way, because ultimately that's what it means to be an educator in the 21st century, and especially an Ignatian educator. So I think I've already kind of talked about the next slide, but we took this to the cohort gatherings and just focused on, again, the IPP, the universal apostolic preferences, and those 4 strands from the global colloquium a couple of years ago. And then, of course, the last step of the IPP evaluation wouldn't be complete without getting some feedback from faculty. And so we've done that over the course of the year and are beginning to kind of sift through that. We feel like we've only begun to scratch the surface, but I will say that one of the key points for Greg and I has been able, or for Greg, Russ, and I has been able to work together as a team. So the fact that there were 3 of us collaborating together and building, sort of building a curriculum was huge. We don't currently have anything like a PLC model at Jesuit. And so this is probably the closest to something like this that I've done. And I know Russ is going to talk a little bit more about the process that we've been using. But I really, really want to emphasize that those of you who are in schools, and you know this, but the leverage that we had working together as a team was really important. And it took a lot of time. I mean, we've spent a couple hours a week together every week, building out some of the things that we've been doing with our faculty.
Yeah, thanks, Jennie. And just to kind of reinforce again, like teams transform. If we didn't have each other, we would not be able to have accomplished what we did this year. So the other thing that does help also is having time and having our administration kind of backing us and trusting in us and giving us that space to experiment with some of these different ideas, these different materials that we've developed. Some other pro tips, for designing IPP enrichment experiences for adult learners real quick. Not only do teams transform, time helps, but also modeling our vision for learning, or really the vision for learning by refraction, right? It's not enough to just stand up in front of a group of people and talk for 40, 45 minutes or for 3 hours or however long it might be. But we really, if we believe in this stuff, if we say we believe in this stuff, then we have to kind of follow that up with real action. And that means assuming roles of designer and facilitator and coach, and positioning our adult learners as inquirers and meaning makers and creators. That's really key. Throughout this year, before we even started building slide decks, we would engage in some backwards design. And in our backwards design, we tried to make these experiences as robust and engaging as possible, which prompted us to create things like anchors and performance tasks, and developing insights and action goals in our design, kind of acting as pillars, really, in our design. And we even conducted some formative assessments and opportunities for question and answer from our faculty, and using surveys, of course, to glean some feedback. So we tried a lot of different things, and it definitely felt like 21st century learning was happening. A few more pro tips real quick, and we've kind of said these already, but practice, practice, practice. Unless you give adult learners opportunities to apply the new information, to their own work, it won't become concrete. That's kind of one of the principles that's really, I think, critical. And then a few growing edges for us. One of the things that I think we are learning or becoming better at, right, is being really transparent with our faculty or our adult learners about what our purpose is. Because in most cases, if that's not clear, then a lot of adult learners are just not going to care. So kind of aligning or being transparent about our purpose, and then also aligning our purpose to the problems that adults express or kind of face on the day-to-day, as well as aligning our purpose to the roles that each of them has, both at Jesuit High School and also the people that we encountered while we were on the road, facilitating the mapping workshops. That's really critical. And then finally, knowing our audience, knowing the context and having a lot of fun with it. Which I think we did a pretty good job of this year. There were several anchors I can think of that we came out with that were kind of a blast for our community members to kind of work through. So with that, looking ahead, we have a few questions that we're thinking about, and we'll be thinking about them this summer as we work. We were awarded a grant to continue doing this work, and we were given more time next year. So we have to kind of figure out where do we go from here. some of the questions we're thinking about. What does a 21st century IPP look like in practice? So this year was very theoretical, but what does it look like in a classroom space or in a program, perhaps in a meeting among faculty members, right? This year we developed a shared language of practice, and we're still developing that shared language of practice. But how can we use that shared language? How can we leverage that to create synergy across departments, between departments and programs, and then also synergy between programs, right? And also in doing that, moving towards more learning equity. And then also, in terms of backwards design, how do all of these different components, I'm thinking specifically of the mission and formation meetings that we had for full faculty IPP enrichment, how do all these different components that we talked about this year breathe together in that backwards design process? And then finally, another question that we're thinking about is assessment. How do we assess in an Ignatian manner in a way that makes sense for student learning in the present and the future? And that's not just designing experiences, right, that act as assessments, right, where kids kind of learn by going through an experience, but also how do we design rubrics, right? What does that look like? So these are some things that we're thinking about as we look ahead to next year. And with that, I think I turn it over to Kristin now for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Russ and Greg and Jennie. And we do have a few moments now for some reflection, some feedback, some questions. If you are in a spot where you are able to turn on your camera, that would be terrific. It just makes for a more interesting session. I would say, as I listen to you, you use the language of meaningful action. You really are in every way modeling that for the students and in our care and for the colleagues that we work with. And I think about, the heart of Jesuit education, of course, is sharing your learning, not keeping it to yourself, but sharing it for the greater good. And it's so it's just very obvious to me that strikes at the core of what you're doing. I also hear so much relevance as we near the end of this school year and the topics that are on all of our minds, the changing nature of teaching, the changing nature of conversations around the purpose of learning, technology, artificial intelligence, like everything that Russ, in your portion in particular that you highlighted, it's really there. And the spirit of learning as deeply transformative, less transactional. So you've kind of brought all of these big ideas that are swimming around here in May to life. And I especially appreciate the language of thinking of learners as positioning them as inquirers, as meaning makers or change makers, I think you said, as creators. So I can't think of a school in the network that isn't interested in wondering if mission and formation is not just in the air, but if it really is on the ground and woven into the fabric of our actions. So thank you for shedding light on your work. I'm interested, so we have some time for Q&A, and I'm going to kick us off. I'm interested in hearing about your experience of any points of tension that you might have felt or that might have surprised you kind of along the way, something maybe that you weren't expecting as you shared your learning.
I know one thing, as we were creating our all faculty presentations and trying to think of examples to use, etc., we bumped into the teachers, particularly around the idea of insights and reflection and action goals. It really hard at times. We didn't expect that the math department really didn't find as great a connection as, let's say, the English department, theology department, history department, and even the science department. So it was a challenge for us to say, okay, we've got to really understand the totality of our audience and our audience members. We can't assume that this stuff is going to work easily in all disciplines.
Yeah, great. I think that's a great start, Greg. I think also just the challenge of meeting teachers where they're at. I mean, I mentioned this when you've got first year teachers and you've got teachers who've been at the school for 30 years who feel like they know the IPP, and I've been here 19 years, right? I know it very well, but how are we doing? And that's where it's good for us to get feedback on, are we resonating with both of those and the teachers who are somewhere in the middle? And so we tried some activities. Not everybody loved them, but like one of our first, it was around Halloween. We had a superhero theme. And so we had them think about context. What is the context that you bring? What's your kryptonite? What are your superpowers that you bring to the classroom? And have them design, kind of brought out markers and pencils in a hope to engage people in a different way and to begin to think about this and hopefully have that trickle through. And it did actually. Our student government for Teacher Appreciation Week, their theme was superheroes, and it came out of our student government teacher hearing that and kind of wanting to reinforce it. So I think that's probably one of the biggest tension points, and will continue to be for us, is how do we meet the needs of all of the teachers?
I would echo what Jennie and Greg said, and I would just add that I knew that this was the case, this was going to be the case, but I suppose I was a little naive in the beginning about managing self and managing ourselves as we're doing change work. I wonder sometimes if we were a little too hard on ourselves also, that's easy to do because there is so much pressure packed into, like, say, a 40-minute time period. And there are so many opinions out there and stuff like that. So, one of the other insights, I think, and this kind of fits in with the last one, not only have fun, with what you're doing, but also go easy on yourself when you're trying to do these things, especially if you're alone too. I can't imagine what that's like. Having a team working together was huge, but doing it alone, that takes a whole other level of bravery. So, yeah, that's what I would add.
Thank you. A reminder, we are always our own worst critic, right, Russ? What else? What other, a few moments here before the end of the hour for some questions or feedback from the folks here on the call. So please just hop in.
I'll go ahead and add while people are thinking. One of the things that we landed on towards the end of our meetings, again, we had 5, but the last 2 or 3, we had people sit by department as well, and found that to be really helpful for leveraging kind of internal conversations as we had people look more at their discipline and try to create, go deeper as a department or a sub-department. And we found that more valuable than people just sitting wherever in the room.
In response to the question that came up in the chat, most all of our teachers were not familiar with the book that Russ and Jennie and I use, which is Learning by Refraction by Johnny Go and Rita Edizenza. Kind of hard to get a hard copy. They're available on Amazon as Kindle books, but hard to get a hard copy. We each have a copy, but our faculty and staff was not familiar with that at all. So we saw it as our mission this year was to try and basically take this book and find the key gems in it and present it and give our teachers those things as tools. So yeah, they didn't have contact with the book's content.
And as Russ alluded to, one of the key areas of focus for us next year, now that we've set up, how do we know our students' context? How do we know our own context? How do we build this experience and experiential learning? We'll be looking at assessment. So we hope to spend a lot of time at revamping and looking at practicing how do we look at assessment in a way that's meaningful and authentic for our students. A big part of this course also talked about, you have, and we know this, but we don't always do it. If action and reflection are really critical for our students and for Ignatian education, then we also need to assess in a way that allows for that to become clear and at the forefront and the most important part of how we're structuring our classes. And again, that takes time. So how do we do that in an authentic way?
I'll reiterate, I think one of the greatest values was the 3 of us taking the course together, and the 3 of us being at various stages of our careers. That has really helped us have a sense of the constituents, the people that we're presenting to, We each have our own lens that we can bring to the planning. It's really, really helpful.
I have a question for you. Thanks. First, thanks for presenting. You mentioned in the when you were speaking about the retreat for new employees that you gave them time to practice. Was that time to practice in engaging with this method, or to practice to use the method in their classrooms, or both?
It was more getting them to understand what the process would be like in a classroom. And we modeled it, and they then became the students, and we the facilitators. But we also tried to give them time to reflect on their own teaching and to say, okay, what would this look like, and what would this mean for me in my classroom as I look forward to a new year? So time to reflect on that type of stuff, and to develop some sort of 1 or 2 action goals that they would do differently for the year.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would add too, a lot of the practice, not so much in the new faculty retreats, but I think more so in the mission and formation meetings, when we were going through each of the components of the 21st century IPP. For instance, one of those experiences was, one of the workshops was about experience design. So we gave them a performance task design sheet. And after we kind of introduced a few key ideas about, or principles for experience design that came from Learning by Refraction, we allotted, I think, like 15 minutes or 20 minutes or so for teachers to work with a partner, whether it's people within their department, or perhaps maybe it was an interdepartmental collaboration, but they would build an experience just to kind of try it on and see how it felt. So that's just one example. Giving people tools, to design things was really great. And then after every meeting, we would follow up again with links to those tools. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
And speaking of tools, in the chat, I put a link to, it's just a very basic template for what we use. So kind of some follow-up resources that has our contact information, and then the UPenn template that Russ mentioned at the beginning that we modeled things off of with the IPP as our focus. But the design sketch template in particular, we gave you a blank, sort of like a blank slate. Let's see if I can share it right now. Because we know ourselves that part of the process of actually going through this, the three of us sitting down and saying, what's our guiding question? What are the key insights or thesis statements that we want our adult learners to come away with? What are the action goals? Again, the context, the anchor, what's the content and the application? This was, for us, gold. There's so many times, and we know this from all of our own experience, that it's really easy to get off task and to go down a sort of a rabbit hole. But by figuring out what our insights were, those key thesis statements for each of our meetings, that allowed us then to go and design. And I shared this earlier, what's your superpowers, or what's your kryptonite that you have? And then that allowed us to get to the point where we could be creative and fun and figure out what was that hook that we wanted people to have. And so we encourage you to use that. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We know how important it is to collaborate and not do some of this work in isolation.
Thank you all. I think I'll be mindful of time here, and knowing that we just have a moment or two left. So thank you for sharing the learning. I think it's so obvious the time and the energy and the care that has gone into even this brief presentation, let alone all the work that led up to it. So thank you for that. It is exactly what we hope for when we aim for the summer masterclass experience. Again, that you'll share this learning in your own communities and then well beyond, as this inquiry session signifies. So the inspiration to end this school year, positioning ourselves as inquirers, I love that. And I love to think back to the first slide that you had, the quote from 1996, the meaning of Knowing has shifted from being able to remember and repeat information to being able to find and use it. And that was in 1996. Here we are, however many years later. So you have challenged us to put this into practice. So thank you to Jennie Kuenz, to Greg Allen, to Russ Fiorella, to the community at Jesuit Portland who has supported this. And thank you to everyone here on the call. We'll be sure to share this video, the recorded session, knowing it's a tough time of year to get here live. So we'll share the recorded video with you. Please share it widely within your communities. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here.